Okay. Uh, okay, just waiting for everything here to populate with people. But good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Caramile. I'm the Inland Fish Program Manager, and tonight we're gonna talk to you guys about the resident native trout harvest management policy. So just gonna wait a few seconds here as people. Oh, there we go. There's a whole bunch of people. Okay, well, why don't I start off with some introductions here of everyone, and then we will move into a presentation, and I probably have about 15 or 20 slides. So once again, I'm Steve Caramile. I'm the Inland Program Manager, and I'm a centralized employee along with Kurt Hughes, the Fish Management Division Manager. And what we do is we provide kind of some overall broad guidance to our regional staff. And we've been working on this harvest management policy with our regional fish program managers, all through on our screen here. So from Region 1, we've got Chris Donnelly out of Spokane. Region 2, we got Chad Jackson. Chad's out of Ephrata. And Region 3, Trevor Hutton. Trevor is out of our Yakima office. Edward Elizer's from Region 4 up in Mill Creek. Bryce Glasser is from Region 5. And then we have our James Losey from Region 6. And I think this is going to be James's last meeting with us. So thanks for attending, James. So what I'm going to do is switch over here and share my screen. Tell me when you guys get that, please.
Looks good.
Okay, right on. So we're just going to start off here. So once again, my name is Steve Caramile. We're going to talk to you tonight about the resident native trout harvest management policy that we're developing for our Fish and Wildlife Commission. Just for a quick presentation overview here, I'm just going to take a few slides really quickly to give you guys some review of the background on how we got here and what we accomplished to date. And then we're going to go into a few more slides, just walking you through how we are currently visualizing the framework of this policy. And then in the end, I'll point out where to go to provide comment, and then answer any questions that you guys might have on the process. So just for a quick review, this process started with a petition that was received last August, so about a year ago, by the Fish and Wildlife Commission, requesting the statewide protection of resident forms of wild steelhead, meaning rainbow trout. So with that petition, 4 rules were requested by the petitioner: statewide year-round catch and release and selective gear rules, so no bait in rivers and streams of wild steelhead. And then also closed waters and designated wild steelhead gene banks and also watersheds with under escaped wild steelhead. Staff recommended at the time that the Fish and Wildlife Commission deny this petition, as we have the stream strategy for our foundation for wild trout regulations. And the department has also implemented, many additional site-specific rules over the years to provide additional protections where staff felt it was needed. So the Fish and Wildlife Commission concurred and directed staff to develop a native resident trout harvest management policy to provide guidance for any future rulemaking. Okay, so this is the schedule, and I think a lot of you, I saw some names here. A lot of you guys have already seen the schedule, but we put the scope and timeline that back in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission in December, and then with the public in February, I think it was. Since then, we've pretty much stayed on task. In December, again, we shared the scope and timeline with the Fish Committee. And then in January, we moved forward with a coordination letter to the tribes, and again, sharing the scope and timeline, inviting their comment and input. And then mid-February, we held our first town hall meeting, which was, again, sharing the scope and the timeline. And I think more importantly, highlighting all the points along the way for public input. And, one of those being tonight. And, again, that kind of brings us to today, which is our second town hall meeting. At the fish committee meeting last month, it was about a month ago now, the chair did ask us about possibly shortening up the schedule here a little bit. This is due to be done in September of 2025. And I think what we're going to do is, kind of, reassess probably in the December timeframe, probably December, and see if we think we can shorten this up by a couple of months. But currently, this is, our current schedule. So then there was our first town hall meeting. We held that on the evening of February 12th from 6 to 8. We had about 50 people in attendance, and we shared with the public the exact same thing that we shared with the fish committee in December, and that was the draft scope and timeline. And I think, more importantly, again, we specifically highlighted the points for public input and comment throughout the rest of the process. I think the main takeaway for us from that meeting is that there was definitely some interest from the public in what we were doing, and I think a lot of people were glad to see that we're engaged in this process. I also think that people understood, that was our initial meeting. We didn't really have anything to share that was concrete or something to really hold on to. So I think people were just looking forward to tonight, to seeing some of what we've done over the past couple of months, and looking for the ability to provide some input. Okay, so next we're going to talk about our draft framework, of the policy that we're working on. And we don't have the whole policy completed. We're working on it. I don't know. I'll probably say it'll probably be a 10 or 15 page document, something like that. We're working on the introduction, the background, which is going to include parts of our stream strategy and our rule simplification process. And it's also going to be, summarizing some of our angler preference from our angler preference surveys and things like that. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the basic framework piece. So when we started developing this, we took a page from our non-native game fish policy development, and we created a small, 2x3 matrix where the rows in the matrix are geographic areas. And we identified two main geographic areas, one, the anadromous zone, and two, areas of limited or no connectivity to the anadromous zone. And those are, well, a lot of our lakes have no connectivity. Some of our bigger reservoirs, especially over in eastern Washington, just think Banks Lake or Potholes. I mean, they eventually drain to the Columbia. So there's connectivity to the anadromous zone, but there's no upward movement of fish, right? Originally, we had more detailed breakouts. We had above and below barriers, main stem versus headwaters, areas with and without anadromous fisheries. But when we sat down and started developing options, there seemed to be a lot of duplicity. And when we started thinking about policy statements, so we settled on basically these two geographic areas, as it's simpler and definitely much cleaner. Then there's three conservation core categories, and those are going to be the columns in the matrix that I'm going to show you here in a few minutes. The first one is going to be no known conservation concerns for resident native trout. And those are areas where, our current harvest rules are they're adequately protective. Areas where we have the least risk and probably the most options for how we manage. In the middle of what I'm going to show you here in a few minutes is going to be the known conservation concerns for resident native trout. And those are going to be areas where we can show that harvest is impacting trout populations. And these options will be more restrictive or more protective. And then last, again, the next slide is going to have the matrix, and it's going to be all the way on your right. It's the known conservation concerns for juvenile salmon or steelhead. And this is where we have evidence that fishing for trout is causing impacts to juvenile salmon or steelhead production or outmigration. So one of the things that you're not seeing here is a SGCN, so a species of greatest conservation need. The last time we got together, this is something that we were still thinking about, you know, how we're going to include SGCN species, or if we need to include SGCN species. So that's still on our list to be chatting about. Okay, so this is the matrix that we developed, so when you look at this online, it's actually going to look a little bit differently. We had to make this in more of a list form so it could be read by text readers. But this is really good to look at visually. So I used this one here in the presentation. So again, the rows here are going to be the two geographical areas. So the top one here, Najumas zone, the bottom rows or section is going to be the no or limited connectivity to the Najumas zone. And then the columns are the conservation concerns. So for most of the cells in this matrix, you know, we're going to be providing multiple policy language options for consideration that have a range of guidance options from more liberal to more conservative. So if you're looking in this first box up here, this box A is going to be more liberal, and then box C is going to be more conservative. So that's kind of how you read this. And again, if you look at this online, it's going to be in a list format, but it'll still be set up the same way. The areas with limited or no connectivity, they're going to have fewer options just because there's fewer risks due to the absence of anadromous fish. And, you know, in the end, the process here is, you know, what we're doing is we're providing options for the Fish and Wildlife Commission to consider in the development of this process, or this policy, I'm sorry, and they will choose the policy language that will end up going into the final document. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to run you through some of this language from the matrix, just kind of quickly, just so you can get a flavor for it. But this draft policy language is example 1, known conservation concerns for resident native trout. It's option B, so it's right there in the middle. And here I'm just going to scroll up again, so it's going to be this one right up in here. So WDFW may promulgate special rules to minimize or eliminate recreational angler harvest of resident native trout. This may include changes to size and/or daily bag limits, seasons, and/or gear restrictions. Rules will be biologically based. And this definitely provides ability for us to have the conservation measures that we need, and it provides a lot of options for us to maintain diversity of opportunity, and that can be, you know, gear restrictions, catch and release, selective gear rules, you know, area closures, and whatever. And one of the big things is this does help us maintain fishing opportunity where appropriate. Okay, this second one, This is for known conservation concerns, impacts to juvenile salmon and steelhead, option A. So again, in that matrix, it was the far upper right-hand corner that we were looking at. So if it can be demonstrated that implementing special rules will minimize or eliminate impacts to juvenile salmon or steelhead when fishing for resident native trout, WDFW may make changes to size and or daily limits, seasons, gear restrictions. Rules will be biologically based and or a term and condition of ESA. Once again, this we feel this provides protection for non-target salmonids and allows us to maintain fisheries where and when appropriate. And the last one here we're just going to go over is going to be a known conservation concern for resident native trout, option C. And that's going to be, close recreational fishing for resident native trout. Closures will be biologically based. And that's a huge impact opportunity in whichever areas that would be for. And we would see that as a significant measure to achieve any targeted conservation objectives. So that's just a few examples of what we've written, but it gives you the flavor, the type of policy statements that we're creating. To view them all, what I'll do is I'll walk you through how to get to the link on our website to where you guys can actually read every single one of them. But we invite you to look online, read through all these, provide comments. There's a link on there to a website we'll go over here in a second to be able to provide written comment, as to whether or not these policy statements encapsulate all the views that we're kind of looking for. We're taking written comment either through our online comment portal or directly, to one of us through August 1st, so it can be part of the public record. We are looking for comments, on this framework matrix. And I think, specifically, just, thinking of how we set this up, do we have the right geographic areas that we're kind of outlining here, the anadromous zone and outside of the anadromous zone? If so, great. If not, can you suggest a different way to set this up? Same with the conservation categories. Currently, we've got 3 conservation categories. Do you think those, cover everything? If so, great. If not, feel free to, write in, what other conservation categories you guys think we should be thinking about. And then the last one is, do we have the right policy statements in there? And that's kind of the big piece here. We're trying to outline this policy, these policy options to be something from liberal to conservative. So are we covering everything that we can put in front of our Fish and Wildlife Commission and have them feel comfortable that they've got something good to choose from? So with that, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through just really quickly how to get to our to all this information online.
Hey, Steve, before we do that, we do have one question in the chat, which is, please explain biologically based versus socially based.
Biologically based versus socially based. Well, a biologically, well, let me put it this way. A socially based rule is something that we may just come up with that sometimes is well, how do I say this? It's kind of a feel-good regulation. It may not actually do anything. Sometimes catch and release doesn't do anything. It really depends on your overall impacts. So that could be a socially based regulation, where one that is biologically based is say all of our salmon rules are all biologically based. Put it that way. I mean, we model these things on a yearly basis to make sure that we have a certain level of impacts. So if we know that we have impacts to trout that aren't what we want, can we model those and design the correct rule for that population?
Thanks. I think that was a good one to cover before we go into the rest of the information, and then we'll hold other questions for a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Let me see if I can. Are you seeing my internet browser?
Yes.
Okay, let me just back up here.
And Leah put the links to the matrix, the PDF description of the matrix in the chat, as well as the link for the commission webpage where it describes all of the background and the information we presented to date.
That's already in the chat?
Yes.
Oh, that's perfect.
As
Okay.
well as the link for the online comment.
Okay, great. You can click on one of those links, save it right now, whatever. If not, just go to our agency website, wdfw.wa.gov, and you can get to this information two ways. You can either scroll all the way to the bottom and click on Fish and Wildlife Commission and Commission Policies, and then click on the Resident Native Trout Harvest Management Policy. Or from our main web page right in the beginning, you just type in trout policy and it'll be the first thing that clicks up. And right here under public input, there's a link to our public input portal. There's the timeline. And then down here at the bottom is all the materials. There's our previous town hall meeting recording, but this bottom link here, this bottom PDF, that is well, it's not the matrix, it's in a list. So, but that's basically the matrix information. Okay. So with that, that is the last slide. So I just want everyone to remember that you know, everything that we've got here is still very draft. We're still pretty much in the beginning of this policy development process. You know, again, if you know, once you read through you know, those policy language options, you know, it'd be great to get some comment on all of that, you know, some written comment on all that through our portal, or, you know, once again, you can send it directly to any one of us, and we'll put that in for record, and we'll see how to incorporate, you know, comments, you know, for the future options here. And then I guess with that, I think we're all happy to entertain any questions people have about process, approach, schedule, you know, anything.
So you can raise your hand by using the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. It doesn't look like we have any people on the phone today. Our first hand is from Gary. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we have you.
All right. Yeah, I just had a comment on the overall language with the categories. I mean, the big problem I see is you have two categories, one with conservation unknown and then a known conservation risk. The problem is this puts the onus on showing there's a conservation concern instead of the other way around, where we have to have data to actually show that we know how the population trend is, because most of the trout populations, resident trout populations in Washington, we don't have the data to understand what the conservation concern is in the first place. So as I see it, the policy as it's written right now is just allowing harvest without data instead of showing that we understand how the population is doing and it can support harvest. It's putting the burden the other way around, show that the population can't support harvest, which is pretty backwards in my opinion. And so I just wanted to put that out there. And I think there really needs to be a category for conservation status unknown. That seems absolutely essential.
And Steve and others, just for awareness, I'm trying to capture comments in a Word document so that we have these in addition to the recording. Hopefully we're capturing everything either through the recording or in a write-up sense.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, thanks, Gary. And if you can put that in online in our portal, that'd be awesome.
Gladly.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Our next hand is from Greg. Greg, go ahead. I just prompted you to unmute.
Hi, Leah. You're asking for Greg?
Yep, we hear you now.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, first of all, Greg Shumick, I'm the executive director of the Coastal Cutthroat Coalition. And I certainly want to, first of all, thank the department for all those and all the staff involved for their hard work in putting this very important policy on wild trout harvest together. It's a vital. The one thing that jumps out right away is that, coastal cutthroat haven't been addressed in any of the last two meetings, except for the commission meeting when one of the commissioners brought up coastal cutthroat trout and how this affects them. So I have some comments to make, but I certainly agree with Gary. When there's a lack of knowledge on a particular trout species or a population of that, we've always had to try to prove conservation efforts to get regulations changed to something more conservatively, but there doesn't seem to be any reason for research to be carried out to be able to continue harvest. And we just think that's not really viable. I think we really should need to have science show that there's proof that we can have a harvest fishery, just like we have to prove for a conservation concern as well. And as far as on the conservative side as well, I like the categories really well, Steve. I just think that maybe some verbiage can be changed too. One that jumps out to me is no conservation concern identified. I think Gary said the same thing. I just really think that should be no conservation concerns been identified. And if it just falls in that same thing. But I'd like to know the status of how you're going to address coastal cutthroat in this.
So Greg, thanks for that. I mean, so coastal cutthroat are one of the trout species that this is covering. So yeah, it's not specifically mentioned as a coastal, but we definitely say that whether it's West Slope or coastal, they're going to be part of this policy.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And Greg, thanks for your letter this morning.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Our next hand is from Andrew. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, yes, this is Andrew Kennefick. I'm the advocacy chair for the Washington Council of Trout Unlimited, and I'm still struggling with I put the question in about biologically based versus socially based. I'm still not sure I'm clear as to what a biologically based restriction on harvest would be. You talked about impacts, but that doesn't sound like a restriction on harvest. Can you give an example of what you mean by a biologically based rule?
Oh, okay. What's it? Did someone just open their mouth there? No. Okay.
Steve, I'm happy to help if you need it.
Yeah, Chris, why don't you go ahead and talk to this one?
Sure. So for instance of a biologically based rule, our current stream strategy looks at what's a conservative rule that allows for some harvest in populations while ensuring that there's natural reproduction to replace those fish that are harvested. So a biologically based rule would be to set a length limit that allows all fish to achieve one spawn at a minimum prior to being subject to harvest. For example, in small streams, it's 2 fish daily. no fish less than 8 inches in length. So for multiple streams with west slope cutthroat and resident coastal cutthroat at higher elevations, it's common for us to see fish spawn at sizes 6 to 8 inches, and then they're subject to harvest. And for coastal cutthroat, it's 14 inches. So that's a biologically based rule. It's based on what we know we wanted to achieve, which was allowing fish to spawn prior to harvest, and then using the information that we've collected from multiple populations to drive that decision. A socially based rule would be to go into a population that's healthy and for no reason other than to offer up multiple types of opportunity. We would be asked by a group to make that a selective gear catch and release fishery for the trophy aspect of the fishery, not because biologically it's mandated for that population to persist.
Thank you. That helps.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was good.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Our next hand is from Kurt. Kurt, go ahead.
Evening, guys, and thank you for your time.
Kurt.
Yeah, I agree with Gary and Greg about the need to put the onus on the fishermen rather than the fish, and whether we fish or not. It seems like we have that a little bit upside down. And I would like to, look at the Adam's example where we had to demonstrate there was a need. I would argue that for many of our steelhead populations, the fact that they're ESA listed automatically establishes the needs for more conservative management. Do you disagree with that?
I think if we know that there's impacts, sure.
Obviously, I mean, when we're looking at the life diversity of old micas in our rivers, and the recent example is, for example, the Elwha, where the resident trout population contributed greatly to the rebound of the summer run population. I don't know that we can argue. At least the argument would be that we have more evidence. The evidence we have is that those fish are pretty important, and if we're going to adopt a policy of erring on the side of the resources, it seems to me that's the rabbit hole we need to go down. And I have a little problem with the example number 2 is we're limiting game fish access because of salmon concerns, but when the salmon has the opportunity, because salmon management may adversely impact the resident trouts, and we don't seem to give those equal shift. For example, I mean, on a river that we might want to ban bait, the argument would be, well, we need bait to go salmon fishing, and therefore you're not going to take care of the resident fish. And I think that's, again, an upside down argument. And the fact is on the Still-Squamish, it's been, the main Still-Squamish has been under a selective gear rules, no bait, etc. Since 1996. And every year, if there's harvestable salmon, they prosecute salmon targeting coho and pinks whenever there's abundance there. And the anglers, based on the turnout we see in the rivers, while they may grumble about it, participate and catch fish. So it seems to me that we can take care of our needs with both the salmon species and the game fish species without, in a consistent fashion. And finally, Chris was talking about, allowing fish to one spawn. And recently I've been looking at in depth at some bull trout, thinking about some bull trout, which I know isn't covered by this, but in this case, a fish like the coastal cutthroat sea runs would have the same concerns. And those fish that are, unlike salmon, that only spawn once, or like steelhead, that only spawn, only about 15% of them spawn a second time. Populations like coastal cutthroat, at least on North Sound, about half the fish in the returning runs are repeat spawners. And those repeat spawners offer a huge stability in those populations. They're larger fish, tend to have more fecund fecundity in the females. There's multiple years in the spawning population. So if there's a drought one year, there's other years to help backfill. So it allows lots of stability. And if there's a problem, having those multiple years lead to faster recovery from any down cycles we have. And I think in some of those fish where I suspect that might be the case in some resident trouts. I'm thinking of something like the Yakima, where those repeat spawners may be critically important for stability, particularly in fish that are living in challenging habitats. And I haven't seen anything talk about that in the discussion so far, but I think that topic needs some thought and consideration. And I'd be happy to expand on any of those if there's questions.
No, I think I'm good. And I think some of that, Kurt, I think is, some of the information that we might be covering, in some of the verbiage in the policy. If that makes sense. I mean, what we presented tonight was just, broad policy guidance statements of, how we, that's going to provide guidance for any future rule making, right? I think some of the other things you're talking about are some of the verbiage that we back up some of these policy statements with.
Well, I mean, we only can respond to what you presented to us.
Yeah.
And I guess,
I get that. I get that.
The gist of what you're hearing, I think, is it probably needs more thought. One of the things I was thinking about, like on, say Puget Sound steelhead streams where you might want to protect resident fish, there may be exceptions, and the state has a way to get out of, to look at that if the default position was selective gear catch and release. And that's through the development of your river management plans, all of what the Region 4 did for the Skagit River, where you develop a steelhead harvest management plan that might consider the resin fish components and others and get it federally approved. And then you have a plan that you can go forward. Lacking that detail, I think you have to follow the default of taking care of all the populations as if they're the worst case scenario until you do those river management plans. And just by the way, the state wild steelhead management plan required river management plans to be developed within 2 years of implementation of the plan, which was in 2008. So you're roughly 15 years late on developing plans in most river systems. But that would give you the flexibility to do something more until those are done. I think if you want to take care of the resource, you're almost obligated to look at selective gears and bait bans whenever there's any fishing in those rivers with ESA listed steelhead. Again, thank you guys.
Thanks, Kurt. Hey, Kurt,
Hey.
and
Yeah.
and a lot of that, you covered a lot. So, I mean, once again, I'm trying to point people with comments to just, it makes it easier for us to not paraphrase what you're saying. So if you can write some of that stuff down into our online portal, that'd be awesome.
I'll try to do that, but again, these are some basic comments that I'm sure you collectively are probably thinking about. And with this AAV listed fishes, there's the burden has to be on the managers to develop the information to move forward instead of the other way around. But I'll get some comments together. But by the 1st of August, is that correct?
Yeah, we typically do the 15-day comment period. Yeah.
But I suspect if I was late, you'd still read it.
You know me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kurt. Steve, if you can probably stop the screen share now if you want. Mix your video and whoever talks a little bit bigger. Our next hand is from Kitty. Kitty, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Kitty Griswold from the Coastal Cutthroat Trout Interagency Commission from Pacific States and longtime Coastal Cutthroat Trout researcher and advocate. Thank you so much, Steve and panel, for this opportunity. A number of folks have already honed in on some of the comments I was going to make about biologically based management criteria. And I'm acutely aware of the the challenges historically and current for monitoring these populations so that we can understand trends and understand what different impacts over time have on these populations. And it requires something that has been pretty elusive, right? Monitoring funds, and that's true across the board for many of these populations who aren't listed, and in particular, coastal cutthroat trout. So I encourage the focus on the comments of what is meant by biologically based for individual species, including repeat spawners like coastal cutthroat trout. Kurt alluded to that, or was, directly spoke to that in his comments. The other issue that I would like to point out in terms of biologically based management programs is that we know as a rule that coastal cutthroat trout are structured at the watershed scale in terms of populations. And so we know that they are unique at the watershed scale. We understand that from the work that was done at University of Washington from Fred Utter and Don Campton and others. They were the pioneers of that work. So the broad brush, which I understand, of the anadromous zone makes sense. I get that. But I'm also concerned that these populations for coastal cutthroat trout in particular, I would say resident trout as well, will vary from watershed to watershed. And what is happening in Willapa Bay versus Puget Sound and North Puget Sound and South Puget Sound versus some of the large rivers or the Olympic Peninsula is going to vary. And so including an understanding of the geographic and the genetic and population diversity within populations should be part of the biologically based management plan. So that said, super appreciate it. I understand that that's going to vary greatly. I know that there's some work that's being done intensively in some areas, and other areas, just have big data gaps. So I understand the challenges, and I'm super appreciative of this process and the opportunity to comment. So thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Kitty. Just a quick little response from me is that, yeah, so we understand that everything is, population based, watershed based. Yeah, the broad brush is just for general guidance, but that general guidance can be, it can be used on a river reach, it can be used on a watershed level, it can be used for a single lake. So, so yes, thank you for all that, and yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm unmuted, but
Yeah, you are.
That will require that biologically based effort and overcoming some of those the barriers and challenges to gathering those data at a river and reach scale.
Yep.
So thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kitty. Our next hand is from Rich. Rich, go ahead.
This is Rich. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, Rich. Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, thanks again for allowing us to comment and your guys' time on this. This is such a important opportunity to create a better conservation strategy for our native and wild fish in the state. And again, there are some super great comments here tonight. And, Kurt and Gary and Kitty, they really hit the nail on the head in a lot of their comments. And it's really hard for me to top any of that. So, but I think, again, it's been a long time since we really looked at what our stream strategies have been. I think, from my understanding, it's been potentially 40 years, maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's my last thought, and whether I'm wrong or not. But, all I can say is, we don't know a lot. We don't have a lot of data in a lot of our regions on wild and native fish. And I think we really need to err on the side of conservation for them and really be thinking that if we don't have the information, we can't really make good harvest decisions. So it's better to potentially be a lot more conservative in those areas. And again, like Kurt brought up, we have ESA listings that we're dealing with, and wilds, resident wild rainbow trout have proven to really kind of help pick up the slack in some of the watersheds when it comes to steelhead. And anyway, I just want to leave it with that. We'll send our comments in, or I'll send my comments in. And I appreciate again the time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rich.
Thanks, Rich. Our next hand is from Mara. Mara, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mara Zimmerman. I'm the Executive Director for the Coast Salmon Partnership. I have a keen interest in your resident native trout harvest management policy, as both resident rainbow and coastal cutthroat are important fish populations and fisheries in the coastal rivers where I both work and recreationally fish. My comments this evening are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of my board. And Steve, I will also submit these in written form online as you requested. In preparing my comments, I considered the department's mandate to preserve, protect, and perpetuate fish and wildlife, as well as to authorize the take of game fish that does not impair the supply of the resource. And in my opinion, the draft resident native trout harvest management policy does not meet this mandate. The draft policy will reinforce the status quo and, in my opinion, is not responsive enough to the intent of the petition, which was to increase statewide protection of resident forms of wild steelhead. Under the draft policy, the current harvest rules would apply to native trout populations with no known conservation concern, and then more limited harvest rules would only apply if conservation concern can be proved. But since there's limited to no data available for most native trout populations, there's no information to prove conservation concern. And since there are no plans that I'm aware to gather more data, there will be no additional information to prove conservation concern. So as a result, the status quo will just be maintained and there's no real change associated with this draft policy. In my opinion, there's every reason to be cautious when authorizing a harvest policy for resident native trout, especially since as has been mentioned, especially since many of the anadromous forms of rainbow trout are ESA listed, and environmental conditions are changing rapidly, especially stream temperatures and flows that affect resident trout living in freshwater year-round. So with that said, I would like to propose two changes in the approach to this policy. My first proposal is to assign unknown conservation status to all native resident trout populations lacking adequate data and default the fisheries in these streams to a catch and release fishery. If and when adequate data are obtained, the status of the population may change to either no conservation concern or conservation concern, and the fishery in that stream adjusted commensurate with the new status. And the point is, as has been mentioned several times tonight, to take a more cautious approach to fish management in the absence of any data. My second proposal is to restrict fishing of native resident trout during seasonal periods of environmental stress, specifically during the summer months when stream temperatures exceed 18 degrees Celsius. So this proposal will be limited to a subset of streams where trout are exposed to these temperatures. The fisheries should either be closed or operate under hoot owl rules that would restrict effort to early morning hours when the daily temperatures are lower. So thank you very much for considering my comments as you continue your work on this important policy.
Thanks, Mara.
Thank you, Mara. Our next hand is from Jessica. Jessica, go ahead.
Good evening, Jess Helsley with the Wild Salmon Center. Appreciate you all taking the time this evening to listen to our feedback. I really sort of echo a lot of what Mara was saying. I do believe that you all have such a unique opportunity before you to do something truly incredible for this resource. And I feel that you dropped the ball on this first round. I do not feel that sort of the intent of the department and the commission was met in this first draft. It absolutely does not put conservation first, but rather prioritizes harvest and fisheries on unknown populations. So I sort of make some similar recommendations to Mara, to a lot of the other speakers that were already speaking this evening. We need to take that conservation first approach. We should change that primary category to conservation status unknown, by which all populations would fall under there, and fisheries would be closed until the department is able to provide enough data and population level assessment to prove that there's no conservation concern to those specific populations. And then if concerns are identified, you can take a series of actions to promulgate rules to allow and permit fisheries. When conservation status is healthy, those rules would become less restricted. I also agree with Mara in the consideration of environmental concerns as you're executing those catch and release fisheries. I also am somebody who loves to go with my niece and nephews and catch a trout and roast it over the fire. So fully understand that there's a desire and a need and a willingness to sort of keep Washingtonians connected to that resource. But considering the dramatic decline that we've seen in the state's fish, steelhead, throughout the state, I think it would be in grave error for us to sort of continue to allow harvest in anadromous waters. So I would recommend that we close harvest of trout fisheries in anadromous waters and only permit those in non-anadromous waters. So again, appreciate your time today. I'm hoping that we all can sort of meet somewhere in the middle to do what's right for the trout in Washington and Washingtonians. Hopefully you all received my comments this morning and look forward to continued dialogue.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jess. Our next hand is from Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist or a director here, so I'm just a little more, I guess, process regulation curious here. But I threw this question in the chat, and it's sort of becoming apparent that we're maybe the data that I'm looking for doesn't exist. But my question was, how are we currently measuring and tracking populations currently, and where could we find that data with historicals to show what's actually happening in the different river systems? And I guess the follow-up would be, if we're not doing that right now, what would it take to find funding to start doing that?
So thanks for that question, Dan. So we do some trout work. We don't do a lot of directed trout work. So, when we design rules, those usually fall on our district bio staff, who actually spend a lot of time in their rivers. So they have a good they may not have population numbers, but they've got a good handle on their fish populations and which ones they think can sustain harvest and which ones can't. We have a lot of very protective regulations around the state, especially around Puget Sound right now. What we do monitor a little bit is we monitor fisheries in some of our coastal streams, some of our Puget Sound streams, to determine, trout impacts. So we do have some fishery data we've had for the past 6 or 7 years, something like that. And the legislature has put some money into freshwater monitoring, which is going to include, trout harvest, which does include trout harvest, and we have that data. And one of the other things that we do, look at on every couple of years is we look at angler use, as on a statewide basis. So we have a pretty good feeling about, we know how many people fish for trout. We know how many people fish for trout in streams. We've got a rough idea of what percentage of streams get a lot of effort. So all that's kind of been part of our regulation setting process over the years. Believe me, I'd be the first one to take more money and give it to the regions to do some more trout work, to hire some more staff to do trout work. And we've been trying to do that. Here this past year, about a year ago, I got a bunch of money from the legislature to start looking at resident fish species across the state. And, it's going to be a long process, but, we're going to be doing population estimates on most of our species, and trout's going to be one of them. So we have some money directed at this, here going on into the future. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sorry, am I muted now, or
No,
quick
you're
follow-up?
not. Yep.
Okay, and quick follow-up. I guess that came into my head because recently, kind of with the Nooksack closure up here, there's some very, precise modeling data, specific to like the exact number of fish projected to return, right? And so I guess my question is there any chance that we'd ever get to that level of precision with the modeling of populations in the river systems?
The term exact, that's a hard one. So, that's a hard one for me to answer. I mean, to get into,
Well, Steve, if I could maybe
Hold on.
add to that.
Just hold on a second, Chris. Yeah, and you can here in a second. But I think one of the things, we do some really good work in some of our areas, Dan. But to get to that level of sophistication with all of our species, I mean, that's a lot of staff time. So I mean, you're talking a lot more staff, almost doubling the size of our fish program. So we can probably get there with harvest in some of those areas as far as a really good harvest estimate. But as far as population numbers, we're gonna be working on that over the next 10 years. But I don't know that we will have we put a lot of money into salmon management, a lot of staff time into salmon management. We won't be there with trout, I don't think. Chris, do you want to add?
Yeah, just some thoughts on, where we have done that level of work. So for example, interior red band rainbow trout in Lake Roosevelt are above the blocked area.
Yep.
We've done that work over the last 2 decades to monitor overall adult abundance to ensure that we aren't impacting that population while fishing on hatchery fish. We've had the funding and the staffing to do it, and we have a much better understanding of interior red band rainbow trout. And I'm happy to share those studies with you and to look at that. But absence that detail of work, when we went through rule simplification and some of the other rule changes I guess it's about 5 years ago, we instituted a lot of rules in coastal streams where we closed it to the harvest of rainbow trout. Essentially, when you eliminate harvest, what you're doing, the default is you're saying that you've just backed out of having to monitor all of the time because you're not running the risk of harvest. And absent more information, that is the most precautionary thing that you can do. It doesn't quite get to where Kurt was, but what you're asking us is, well, are you monitoring those populations? Well, we're not monitoring those populations because we're essentially not harvesting them. It doesn't mean that we couldn't do more work to have a better understanding of their contribution to anadromy or whether there's enough of them there now. But we're not making the situation worse by virtue of harvesting them. So, the challenge is to get to more staffing to be able to do that work. And this is something that I'll let James take it from here because when we get to the coast, it's his issue. Why we went there with red band rainbow trout is that there was a strong desire to harvest those fish. We weren't sure they were abundant enough to do it. We did the work to decide that they weren't, and then we backed out of harvest fisheries for wild red band rainbow trout. And but we're afforded the ability to run fisheries for hatchery fish. So anyway, James, take it from there because I don't want to go any further into coastal stuff.
I think you did a great job there, Chris, and same with you, Steve. Dan, I just wanted to highlight, I think you're bringing up a really important point, sort of identifying this idea that the level of sophistication is just not there with fish management around trout in Washington State. And I think Steve did a really good job of sort of describing, that problem statement isn't one around availability of tools it's not that the work is going to be that much different than the scenario you described associated with salmon. We've got the right people, the brain power, the tools available. The problem, like Steve highlighted, is really prioritization. We've got huge workloads, ESA listed species, commercially important species, and trout find themselves at the bottom of that prioritization list. And so it's not that we don't have people really caring and excited and even, have the tools available. It's just we just don't have the resources to pull the work off. And you highlighted that. I think you did a good job. And I think the question then is, without those tools available, the resources, the prioritization, where does this policy fall in a place where, we don't have the information available? So how should we move forward? So I think that's where we're at. And I just appreciate the comments from you, Dan, and Chris and Steve. I thought you did a great job.
And
Yeah, thanks, James. That was great. That was a great summary there.
And I just saw there was a comment from Rachel about, ask the legislature for more dollars. Yeah, well, we do that on a yearly basis and for certain type of tasks. And once again, with our biodiversity money, I was able to get it, I think over a couple of years, a couple $1 million, so that we are putting that into more of our population management stuff. So.
Thank you, Dan. Our next hand is from Guy. Guy, go ahead.
Hey, Steve.
Hey,
This is
Guy.
Guy. Hey, thanks. So a lot of the issues have been brought up in the interim when I raised my hand and done this. And obviously we're in a data poor situation. And I think James just spoke to it really well. But we do know, for instance, and I can speak about steelhead in this case, that we know they spend 1 to 5 years as residents. We know that, right? And if you think about it, if a fish spends that much time in freshwater and then goes out to sea for a couple of years and then comes back, it spent more of its time in the freshwater. So it does have a large role in overall stock assessment and dynamics of that species in particular. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that there's that side of it too, at least for steelhead. And I guess I would hate to have you guys managing me, because if I only got to spawn once and you get to harvest me, I think that would be tough on me. So anyway, I'm not sure if the one, age at maturity is a good, I would like to see the data. I'd like to see the research on that. And my next question is, how do you write policy without good data? I mean, it seems, you're going to have to write policies that say we don't have the data, so we're going to have to maybe err to the side of conservation. And with all this said, what obvious to me is the request from the Fish Committee to advance the schedule, I think, is not a good idea. I think we have a lot to think and talk about here. So I would not think that's a good idea. And that's all I have to say right now. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Guy. And and as far as advancing the schedule goes, I think that was just a question whether or not that was a possibility. I think when we first developed a schedule, we lined it out, knowing that we have, especially in the springtime, north of Falcon, which, no one's available during that time frame. So, what looks like, a year and a half or 2 years of work is actually probably, half that. So, but thanks for that.
Thanks, Guy. Our next hand, Kurt has his hand back up. Kurt, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate this, but while we were talking, a couple of thoughts occurred to me, and there was some talk about the department's stream strategy, which, as I recall, was developed by Sam Wright in '84 and '85, and I think somewhere in my back there's still some scar tissues of the adverse reactions we got from the public. But I think it's important to realize that since '85, the population in the state's roughly doubled. And we got the issues of climate change. We have, declining salmon populations in almost all of our streams, which addresses the nutrient loads. So we're dealing in a much different world than we were 40 years ago. And I would argue again for some sort of more conservatism there, just something to put in context. I would hope an adjunct that comes out of your guys' effort would be some sort of wish list, if you will, of projects that could be done to increase, the manager's knowledge of what's going on with these resources, and it would take some prioritization for sure. But I think an untapped resource that you might be able to use is the anglers' interest themselves. And I'm thinking of, measuring a fish and getting lake frequencies as kind of a default for age structure. I mean, some of these, relatively low populations have really interesting age structures. I know in North Sound, I sampled thousands of and looked at thousands of sea run cutthroat scales, and there were a lot of fish that spawned, as many as 4 or 5, even sometimes 6 times. And and lake frequencies was a good, or at least a fair representation of what that age structure looked like. The resin rainbows in at least the Skagit Basin, I found resin fish as old as 10 years old, fish that had spawned as many as 6 times. Those are remarkable things. If you're finding those kinds of individuals in the population, I think it says something about it. And I think one way to get there would be, some volunteer anglers collecting, specific data that you're interested in. And I'm confident that you guys would not take very long to come up with a list of wishes where you had more information. The other untapped resource for different information, especially with coastal cutthroat, is periodically the state and the co-managers do like coho studies on productivity and trap tributaries. Often those tributaries produce a fair number of cutthroat, and I think there's an opportunity to piggyback on some of that trapping effort and getting some trap coho out there, or clip coho. And then with angler effort, you could look at what contributions they are and begin actually developing some basin-wide population estimates, which would be a fantastic step forward for your folks. But anyway, I think that I just wanted to throw that out there as not all doom and gloom. There's opportunities here, and I encourage you to look at. And again, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks, Kurt. And Kurt, you talked long enough that we got a couple more hands up, so that's good. Steve, go ahead. Steve Kopp, you have your hand up. Sorry.
Yep. Yes, Steve Kopp from North Sound Trout Unlimited and Fourth Corner Fly Fishers in Bellingham. First, we'd like to thank the department for this work to put some focus on native trout harvest. This has been a topic of conversation among our membership for a long time, really if and how much harvest might negatively impact the fishery, and if the current policies are appropriately protective of the species and the ecosystem health. It's already been said a bit, so to be brief, I'll just reiterate that our membership's interests as conservation organizations in the North Sound who frequent the Nooksack and the Skagit is to take a more cautious conservation approach. Where we don't know, protect it until we do know that they don't need protection. I think the basic outline of this seems like a useful framework, and we look forward to sharing comments online and seeing this work move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. And our last hand at the moment is Jamie. Jamie, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Jamie Glasgow, Wild Fish Conservancy. Hey, Steve. Thanks for the overview.
Sure.
Gosh, I had a long list of things I wanted to say, and they've all been said. So I guess in addition to thanking you, Steve, and the department, I really want to thank the folks who provided feedback tonight. This has been extremely uplifting, and very happy to hear that there is so much concern about how to structure a policy like this in the absence of the data we know we would like or should have, and in the face of so much risk and uncertainty. I guess I'm just going to limit my comment into a process request, which is that the department consider sharing the written comments that are received through the online portal. I think it's going to be really important that those comments are provided to the public and to the commission in full and aren't just paraphrased and shortened and synthesized as sometimes happens. Is that something that can happen?
I'll have to check with public process. What we typically do is we typically bin comments that are, I see Kurt popped his face up here.
Hey, Jamie, how's it going? Nice to see you here tonight. Really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. I would just note that Jonathan Stump asked that similar question to that in the chat. And so my response was that we certainly anticipate reporting back to the commission, the Fish Committee, in a summary of what we heard here tonight and what the public comment online is, and other feedback that we're receiving, like just mentioned that they had sent us a letter this morning. So we'll be providing that information in more of a summary bin type of format. But that said, we would have to go back to the commission because we haven't heard directly from the commission that they are interested in all of the individual comments. But we can certainly entertain their interest in seeing all the individual comments. I know that there's been some discussion as of late about, whether they're getting too much information, not enough information. So we're more than happy to have that conversation.
That's great, Kurt. And just to be clear, I'm not seeing it as an either or. My hope would be that you could still provide them with the synthesis and abstract of the feedback you got, but also provide the comments you've received in writing in full. So those that do have the time and interest to do a deeper dive have that ability. I think it'd be really important to capture, provide that just for transparency.
Yep, absolutely. Understood.
Great, thanks.
And then a question from Andrew or comment, post written comments as they're received rather than wait until the end. So our concern with that is one of, we get into periodically sort of a back and forth, one person posts a comment, and then if it's the information is posted publicly, then someone else might put in a retort, a comment in opposition to that. And so it sort of balloons up a he said, she said, back and forth type of situation that we really want to avoid. We would prefer to have people's comments directed at the agency, not at other commenters. So I think we would shy away from that one.
Yeah, again, just to clarify, I feel like we're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't mean real time.
No, this was another question in the chat.
That's
not you.
Okay.
We're good. Yep.
Great.
Okay, and we have a hand up from Daniel. Daniel, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Jumping in late. Daniel Ritz, I'm one of the editors at Swing the Fly magazine and a longtime patron of Washington Fisheries. And just want to, first of all, thank the agency staff for the opportunity to have this call. And the folks that I represent and speak for in our conservation space are, I think, obviously largely interested in the anadromous species safekeeping. However, we're also really interested in having a healthy relationship with our harvest-oriented angling community, and really appreciate the opportunity to support any initiatives to lean on the air of caution here, and to safeguard and to feel confident in our future processes for wild resident trout harvest practices in the effort to have a wholesome community to work towards, including the safeguarding of our anadromous species. So I'll just leave that there, but really appreciate the opportunity, staff. It's good to see a couple of you guys again. And thanks for having us and for literally just hosting the conversation. So a lot of that's already been said, I'm sure, but got in here late.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel. That was our last hand for now. Just a reminder, there's a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Depending on the Zoom you're running, it might be a reactions tab with a smiley face. Looks like that might be it, Steve.
Perfect. Okay. Well, just a reminder for everyone, please put some comments in online. That really kind of, we tried to capture everything here. I know Kurt and all were furiously writing. But yeah, if you can put things in online that helps us not paraphrase your comments. So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for the comments and questions you had. And look forward to talking to you guys again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate everyone taking the time out of your evening to join us here in the middle of the week, and really appreciate the very the demeanor of the crowd. It's nice to have folks who are very very, I guess I would say, just relaxed and not up in a fervor at our throats. So it's good to feel the appreciation. So that is very clear in your comments and how you guys presented yourself. So we'll look forward to getting some of this stuff back in front of the commission, and look forward to hearing your comments from the online portal and other manners in which we receive them. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.